Welcome to the South African Civil Society Information Service. I'm Fazila, Farouk in Johannesburg. I'm at the offices this morning of the Afro-Middle East Center, where I am to talk to its director, Jeenah. Welcome to SACSIS, Naeem.
Thank you, Fazila.
Now, we're here talking to Naeem because he is an expert on the Arab world, and our topic for discussion this morning is ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Now, ISIS captured world attention last year when it invaded large swathes of land in northern Iraq and Syria to establish a caliphate, which it now governs by sharia law. ISIS has really captured world attention for the brutality which it employs to govern this state which it is ruling. I think the thing that has terrified people most is the beheadings, where they have beheaded people, filmed these beheadings and distributed these films on the internet. People seem to be united throughout the world in their horror with the methods employed by ISIS, and there's general consensus that the organization should be stopped. And we're here specifically to talk to Naeem about what will it take to bring an end or to defeat ISIS. Naeem, that's the question I put to you when I asked for this interview. But before we get into, we know that this is really an extremist organization that needs to be stopped. Can you give us a little bit of background into ISIS? How and why was it established? Who are the people that have joined ISIS, and what do they want?
So ISIS origin, in a sense, comes after the American invasion and occupation of Iraq. And it started off as Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. So it was an Iraqi organization, an Iraqi kind of franchise of Al-Qaeda, if you like. And it maintained that name and that kind of allegiance to the Al-Qaeda leadership for a few years. So it started around 2003 in that kind of form, until around 2006, then changed its name, strangely in some ways, to Islamic State in Iraq. Right? Didn't at the time control any territory, continued to be an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. So not sure entirely why it changed its name in that kind of way rather than remaining Al-Qaeda, but it had pretensions at least of wanting to control Iraq. Then a big kind of milestone was about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, when it sent its people in, or a little before that, sent its people into Syria as part of the uprising in Syria and part of the armed uprising in Syria. They formed a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, one of the Syrian opposition groups. But then after that, not long after that, the Islamic State in Iraq group decided that Jabhat al-Nusra would be subsumed within its... so Jabhat al-Nusra was an Al-Qaeda affiliate, but it wanted it to be subsumed in its structure. And so it created what it called Islamic State in Iraq and Sham. Sham meaning not just Syria, but kind of the Levant, if you like. So Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, etc. That then resulted in a number of battles between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, as it was then called. ISIS then broke away from Al-Qaeda and became its own organization, and was in fact denounced and has been denounced many times, including last week, by Al-Qaeda leadership for being too extreme, for being too brutal, for their brutality being not consistent with Islam, etc. In Syria, they, like many of the other rebel groups, were able to take territory, hold territory, lose territory. It's very fluid in terms of that. But in Syria, in many ways, their victims have been more civilians and other rebel groups than the regime. And so the beginning of some of the conspiracy theories around ISIS comes from there. So I spoke to some of the Syrian rebel groups, commanders, for example, who are convinced that ISIS is a creation of the Syrian regime and Iran, because actually they kill more rebel commanders than they do Syrian officers, is the argument. Now, of course, we have a whole range of other conspiracy theories. ISIS has been created by Mossad, has been created by CIA, etc., etc. So they,
those are the conspiracy theories.
Yes.
What do you believe the real story is?
Let me just finish the story, and then
okay.
So they expanded somewhat in Syria, and in some ways could be regarded as probably the most effective fighting force in Syria. Let's forget about who they actually target, but the most effective fighting force in Syria. And then we had over a year ago, when they year and a half ago, when they took over territory in Iraq. And that was, in a sense, the beginning of their territorial project. So they took over territory in the northeast part of Iraq, which meant that they held contiguous territory across that part of Iraq and parts of southern Syria, and then declared themselves a state, changed their name from Islamic State of Iraq and Sham to just Islamic State, because they believed that they now were a state. They held territory, they defended that territory, etc., and then said that this was the Muslim caliphate. And Baghdadi, the head of it, who became the head of the organization around 2006, 2007, when the previous head died, Baghdadi was now the new Khalif of the Muslims internationally, that would imply. And so we'll talk about what that means.
That's a sort of self-appointed role.
He would say no, because in terms of the theology that they follow, the Khalif cannot be self-appointed. A legitimate Khalif cannot be self-appointed, but has to be appointed by a kind of council of learned, respectable people. So he has a little council around him. Now, the question is, how learned and how respected are they? Because most of the people on the council are actually not known by anyone.
But he is still not representative of Muslims all over the world. People have protested against this organization.
No, he's not. And that's the thing, that the council, even in terms of the theology that they follow, the council that appoints the Khalif needs to be a council made up of people that are well known, that are well respected, that are scholars, if you like, and that in a sense have not necessarily a formal, but have a kind of allegiance from the majority of Muslims. That's how they conceive it. Now, his council has none of those things. In terms of the conspiracy theories, I mean, I'm very skeptical about all of these. I certainly don't believe that ISIS was created by Iran and the Syrian regime, despite however they might be conducting themselves in Syria. I don't believe that they were a creation of the CIA or Mossad. Yes, it is true that many people in ISIS, including some in the leadership of ISIS, were trained at a US training camp in Jordan. Okay, but at that training camp in Jordan, a number of rebels from Syria were trained. What happened to them when they went back to Syria, it might be another matter. But they were chosen as part of what the US regarded as moderate opposition. They were given military training, and then some of them later became part of what then became ISIS. That doesn't mean that they necessarily are representing the US or a creation of the US, etc. So I'm not convinced about any of these kind of conspiracy theories. I think that ISIS arose out of a process that began with the American occupation of Iraq, and in some ways its origin was something of a homegrown thing. Baghdadi himself, not his real name, of course, Baghdadi himself was an officer in Saddam Hussein's army before the occupation, right? So the initial core of it was homegrown. Now probably the bulk of ISIS is not Iraqi or Syrian, but is foreign.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that, because I understand that the group has got 15,000 militants made up of people from up to 80 countries around the world. And what's quite shocking is that 2,000 of those individuals come from Western Europe. What is it about ISIS that appeals to such a wide range of people? And we just heard this morning that there's a South African family that has lost their daughters to this organization. What is it about them that appeals to people? And also in the countries of origin, what are the push factors, besides ISIS's pull factors, that influence people to join them?
I'm going to try to answer the question, but let me say, if we were able to properly and correctly answer that question, I think it'll go a long way in the battle against ISIS. But I think that there are two sets of factors in the main, both push and pull, that attract people to ISIS, those are attracted. And the attraction in South Africa is actually minimal. So this couple that we heard of this morning was reported in some of the newspapers, and then one of the online newspapers yesterday had a story about another, perhaps South African. So 3 maybe. If you look at France, you look at thousands in Western Europe, right? So it's quite a big difference. But so I would say 2 sets of factors. One set of factors is frustration around various kinds of, let's say, Muslim causes. More broadly put, frustration about the manner in which imperialism has been operating, particularly in the Muslim world. So people who are upset about everything from Palestine to what's happening in Syria, to the American occupation of Iraq, etc., and have reached a point where they feel that there's just this war against Muslims and no one's doing anything about it. We have to stand up for ourselves, right? Part of that also is that if you compare ISIS, for example, to Al-Qaeda, the same people that are now saying they're attracted to ISIS were not attracted to Al-Qaeda necessarily a few years ago. So what's the difference? Well, part of the difference from their mindset is that ISIS is showing you that they can have victories. They actually control territory. They've created a state, right? So things can be done. The American imperialism can be stopped. They're confronting the Americans. They're having victories against the Americans. These are the people we should be supporting. Okay, so there's that whole kind of set of things, from everything that's happening in the Muslim world, and for those who are slightly more progressive, broader than the Muslim world, including the role of American/Western imperialism, etc. The other set of factors is to do much more with kind of an attraction to the Islamic discourse that ISIS is putting forward. So, for many Muslims, and not necessarily the majority or all or anything, but for many Muslims, there's this kind of dream of a caliphate. Let's forget the fact that for a lot of the Muslim history over the past 1400 years, those who were heading these so-called caliphates were corrupt and drunkards and promiscuous and whatever. Forget all that. But the notion of a caliphate, which was destroyed finally by Western imperialism in the early 20th century, with the Ottoman Caliphate after the First World War. For many Muslims, that still is a kind of dream. For most Muslims that have that kind of dream, it's, let's say, an esoteric dream, an abstract dream. But suddenly here you have someone who claims that it's real, that it can be real. Okay, so there are many people who are in that frame of mind who are now questioning, okay, is this real? Is this the caliphate? He's declared himself a caliph. He's got counsel around him that says he is. Maybe we should give it a chance. So there's that kind of discourse that then also the Islamic arguments that they put forward, and again, they're not necessarily Islamic arguments that all Muslims, most Muslims, large number of Muslims even necessarily agree with, but it becomes attractive for a certain group of people. In between these two sets of factors, there's also a sense of, and I'm not saying it's a third set, but in between these, There's also an element that is attracted to ISIS that I think is an element of adventurism. There's a possibility of doing something, it sounds exciting, hipsters, young people who want to take up a gun and confront the man, the system, whatever, who might in a year or two outgrow that and leave, right? But there is also that element. There was an article recently by a Western journalist who was captured by ISIS and spent a good few months there with them. And I don't think that what he says is representative of the whole organization, but the place where he was being held, he said he didn't see a single copy of the Quran. He never heard any Islamic discussions or discourse taking place. And these guys were young, gung-ho men who thought that carrying a gun and doing something was great. So there's also that kind of factor in between. So there's a number of these kind of factors that make ISIS attractive for a certain kind of person. I think if we understood that much better, we'd be able to counter that, but we need to start.
So let's get to the question that I came to ask you in the first place. What exactly do you think it'll take to defeat ISIS?
Yeah, this is a big question. I think at two levels that this needs to be done. One is that the IS campaign itself is very much a military one. Yes, there's political elements, they hold territory, they implement laws, etc. Yes, but it's very much a military campaign, and it has to be addressed at a military level. So that's the first thing. I don't believe that we should be having a US-led coalition in this. I think that it should be a coalition that's led by states and groups, non-state actors as well in the region. And I'm making the point about non-state actors because, you know, the most decisive, most symbolic decisive victory against ISIS was Kobani, the Kurdish town. And ISIS was defeated in Kobani not by any state actors, but by Kurdish groups that are actually outlawed by the other countries. So it needs to be driven by actors in the region, whose countries ISIS is invading and taking control of, etc., and who need to take ownership of that. I'm not very supportive of the notion of a US-led coalition, kind of, you know, flying the American agenda in and getting everyone to follow that. But it needs to be military. So that's the one level I think that has to happen. The other level is to stop ISIS growth at the level of its recruits. And I think a very important part of this, and this hasn't been recognized for a long time. I think that just in the past few weeks, we've been saying it as AMEC for the past year and a half. But in the past weeks, past 2 or 3 weeks, it's become something in the American media in particular. And that is that in order to stop or to stem the recruitment of ISIS, you need to deal with it at the ideological level, at the level of the ideological battle. And that means engaging with the Islamic theological arguments. Again, this is not a battle that should be led by the Americans or whoever from outside, in a sense. This is a battle that needs to be conducted within the Muslim community. But it is having to counter all of those arguments that ISIS makes. The bigger picture arguments about caliphate, etc., but also the smaller arguments about things like whether you can burn someone to death as a punishment or take sex slaves, etc. Those are that battle, I think, is what needs to take place outside of the territory that's controlled by ISIS, in South Africa, in Europe, in North America, in various parts of the Muslim world, Malaysia, etc., where they might be getting recruits from, or they might be trying to recruit people from. And I think that kind of thing in the long term That is what is going to successfully conducting that battle is what will strangle ISIS. Because if they don't have any more recruits coming in, then that's going to cause them to wither. But that's a very crucial part of the battle. Without it, the military thing is not going to make much sense.
And in your view, how far away are we from seeing any resolution to the current crisis?
The ISIS crisis. I think we're not close. I think that what we've seen over the past couple of months, or past few months, is that they're not succeeding in expanding in terms of territory. They've lost territory here or there. I don't think that that's substantial enough to say that they're on the back foot, but they're not expanding. They would like to expand in a way that they're able to control at least the whole of Iraq and the whole of Syria. They're not expanding in terms of the territory they're controlling, but I don't think that they're being substantially constrained either. So the amount of territory they're controlling is not being decreased substantially, and the number of recruits that they're getting in is not being decreased at a substantial level. So I think that it's going to last for quite a while.
Even a few years?
I think a few years, because even after major, let's assume that there was by the end of this year, there's a major defeat of ISIS. ISIS is very good at operating as a guerrilla organization. And so both in Iraq and Syria, you will find that they will continue operating, even as small ragtag groups, if that's what it takes, continue operating for a good few years, I think. Even if they don't get many more recruits, they're not able to hold any territory, they could still continue operating. So I think that we stuck with this for a while. We haven't turned the corner at a military level. They're not on the back foot. The number of recruits is not decreasing substantially yet. But once we get there, it's still going to take a few years.
Naeem, thank you very much for joining us at SACSIS.
Thank you.
And thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us at the South African Civil Society Information Service. And remember, if you want more social justice news and analysis, you can get that at saxis.org.za.